All right, 250 years after Paul Revere's midnight ride, the United States Supreme Court takes a midnight ride of its own. Uh, John, pretty unprecedented for the court to act so quickly. It sort of put itself in that position by relieving the earlier TRO in that 5-4 decision that I think we've talked about and been critical of in the past. But this, 6 members of the court acting very swiftly to halt deportations. John, maybe to start out, let's talk about a little bit more detail about what's going on there.
Well, yeah, it was I think it was one a.m. in the morning, early Saturday morning. They issued an injunction basically saying the Trump administration cannot deport anyone under the Enemy Aliens Act. And this is kind of unprecedented for a couple of things. The first thing is that the Fifth Circuit had already kind of passed and said, no, we're not going to have anything to do with this right now. And the Supreme Court jumped in and said, oh, hold on. Let's actually take a closer look at this before we move any further, because Judge Boasberg, who has been in the news quite a lot recently over all of this, has basically taken the government at its word when they said, no, we're not going to fly anyone out of the country to the El Salvadorian prison over the weekend. And so he took the government at its word there and said, okay, fine, I will not issue a temporary restraining order myself. And the Supreme Court just says, nope, we're going to do it. And so that's kind of unusual on its face. I also kind of, at this point, Judge Boasberg, Your Honor, don't you understand that you can't trust the Trump administration to just take their word for it? They've already defied you before. You know, they had planes in the air flying people away after you told them to turn them around and bring them back to the United States. So I think that's a bit naive on his part. Also, there were reports of actual people on buses headed to the airport to be sent to El Salvador. So yeah, it's also unusual that the two people, it was actually a 7-0 decision, so with two dissenting, with Alito and Thomas dissenting. And I haven't dug into their dissent a lot, but most of it was mainly over the timing of it all, that it was a little too rushed to get into it. They didn't really say that it was a
Yeah.
bad thing to issue this temporary restraining order, more that it was a little too rushed, and the Supreme Court should have taken more time to do that.
It's
But I
nice to
think
see a majority. It's nice to see a majority of the court recognize
it,
the exigency of the moment, and not only because there are literally buses rolling, and this is an administration that's taken the position that once they can get you anywhere outside the country, they can ignore every court order issued to have any sort of bearing on whether that deportation was actually legitimate or not. So, to some extent, the administration's own stepping way outside the bounds of normalcy have created this exotic situation where the court can't afford to wait for a proper process to take place before issuing these injunctions, because the administration has no intention of abiding by a proper timeline or a proper process. But it is, to your point, it's not entirely clear to me, John, whether the administration is lying to its own attorneys and sending them into court with incomplete or inaccurate information, or assuring them of one thing and then acting differently behind their back, or whether the administration's attorneys are lying directly to the court, knowingly to the court. I think we're rapidly approaching a point where that distinction is not going to matter, where courts are going to have to now presume that they're not being dealt with in good faith by this administration, that they're not being given good and accurate information. And, I don't know this answer. Neither of us are attorneys, but there is a point where repeated dishonesty, particularly in front of and to the court, is something that can result in attorneys being disbarred. So,
and
so,
even
so this is
jail,
not without
even jail.
jeopardy for the government's attorneys.
Right. Well, so I don't know the exact date, but the government is under pressure from Judge Boasberg on his previous TRO, which said, hey, no planes should be leaving for El Salvador. You need to turn them around if you have them in the air. And they ignored that order. And he has already threatened jail time with criminal charging, even saying that he would appoint a special prosecutor to go after the government attorneys who wouldn't cooperate in his investigation on, was he lied to? Were his instructions ignored? It seems to me, I think that's in either, I think that might actually be today or in the next few days, on when we're actually supposed to hear, he's supposed to hear from the government on what exactly happened. That he, okay, he basically told the government's attorneys, you either need to tell me what's going on, or you need to tell me who knows what's going on so that I can bring them into my court. He basically, he lambasted them, said, you cancel all your vacations. You're not going to miss this. This is going to be done on my schedule. You have to listen to me. And I don't think people realize that a judge is king in his own courtroom, and how much power a judge actually has over the people sitting in his courtroom. He is pretty fairly unlimited in his ability to order things to be done. Now, how far the Trump administration goes to cooperate with that, I think we've seen their strategy so far is to just completely ignore. I mean, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0. It could not be more clear. 9-0 to facilitate the return of Kilmar Garcia, and they've done nothing. And
Right.
their excuse is, well, we can't do anything. And then you ask the El Salvadorian president, well, he can't do anything either. I'm sorry, but if we are paying for him to be there, there's absolutely things we can do. The great line, of course, is, "Oh, you want us to invade El Salvador to get him back." I'm like, no, there's a lot of steps, a lot of steps that can be taken that don't even come close to that. Either, again, just stop paying El Salvador the money that you're paying to keep him there. Then they'll have no reason to keep him in prison. Obviously, we've had the situation where the senator came from Maryland, went down there, actually verified that he was alive, that he was actually in prison. And you're talking about how where the government was the government lying to its attorneys, or were the attorneys lying to the judge? Well, just a week or two ago, the attorney for the government told Judge Boasberg that Mr. Garcia was in that prison, this CCOT, in that prison in El Salvador, when we now have proof that he wasn't actually there at that time that the government attorney made that statement. Did the government know about where his whereabouts? Did the government tell the attorney something different? Did the attorney know and lie to the judge? We don't know. It's going to be really fascinating to watch Judge Boasberg kind of dig into this and figure out, okay, who's lying to me, or who's deceiving me, or is this just a complete breakdown in communication? What's going on. It'll be really fascinating to watch. And the Trump administration is going to kind of just, frankly, their strategy, in my opinion, is just going to be to ignore things. And it'll be interesting to see what steps judges take to force the administration to listen to them. I mean, at some point, he can start ordering government attorneys into jail. He can start ordering government officials into jail for disobedience. As a government official, it's not like you can plead the fifth, right? You can't plead the fifth in your official duties. That is completely out of line. So you have to tell the judge what's going on in your government duties. The only time that you can't, you might get away from that is if it's some classified information. But even then, there are ways to determining, is it actually classified, and then, okay, do we need to have a closed hearing? And there are ways you can get around that so a judge can actually get to the truth. So I think that the Trump administration is going to try to throw up every roadblock that it can. But it seems to me that the judiciary is pretty unified in its constitutional duty, and what it sees as its constitutional duty to hold the government to its constitutional limits. And
It's pretty difficult for the government to make the case that they are even attempting to affect the court's order here, when, as you said, firstly, they continue to pay for the incarceration of individuals in El Salvador. The very first step in attempting to affect that return would be to stop paying for that housing, for that incarceration, stop paying the government of El Salvador directly. And the fact that they're not willing to do that is pretty damning. It's one thing to say, okay, well, we've cut off all ties, but but man, Bukele is just, boy, is he a meanie. He won't give anybody back. But when you're still actually actively contracting for those services and continuing to make payment for to operate a gulag that you are housing Americans in, people who were legal residents of this country, it's very difficult to say that there's any compliance with that order. And secondarily, I'm sure you've seen the White House is absolutely repugnant tweet about, just gleefully, he's never coming back. So it seems like whoever is messaging from the White House, whoever's on the communications team of the White House, doesn't understand the legal implications of the representations that they're making, because they're directly stating that they are a joyous participant in continuing to deprive this gentleman of justice in this case, and continuing to defy that court order overtly. I, I, I mean, if I were an attorney that had to argue the government's side on this, I would, I don't know, resign and reevaluate my life choices.
You would think I have to read from the unanimous opinion of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals
Hmm.
just a few days ago, which so succinctly just puts this case into perspective, because this isn't about immigration. This isn't really about um, gang members. This isn't really about defending America. This is about a power grab, unlike something we've seen at least since World War II. So with the internment of the Japanese, like there is really no other case to compare it to, but I have to read this out because it puts it so well. It is difficult in some cases to get to the very heart of the matter, but in this case, it is not hard at all. The government is asserting the right to stash away residents of this country in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order. Further, it claims in essence that because it has gotten rid of itself of custody, there is nothing that can be done. This should be shocking not only to judges, but to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from the courthouse still hold dear. I don't know how much more succinctly and frankly beautifully you can write than that. I mean, this is a text that will be read in the history books for a long time to come. I would hope that the Supreme Court in its future rulings looks to this text as an example of how it needs to rule and how it needs to defend the right of Americans, because currently you have a Trump administration arguing that it can send anyone it wants to a foreign gulag, and then that there is nothing they can do to bring that person back. It doesn't, like, they're not arguing that they can only do this to non-citizens. They're arguing that they can do it to citizens. They're trying to push that limit and push that boundary. And once you start down that path of being able to send Americans to a foreign prison with no chance of return, boy, you open up the floodgates for a massive abuse of liberty.
Well, and the Fourth Circuit, by the way, that's an amazing. And you'll forgive me for paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, but also I believe that's the same ruling that has the section that talks about how the government may succeed for a time in undermining the legitimacy of the courts, but that ultimately history judges and fills in those gaps, and that the law ultimately writes the epitaph. And if like those are about as close to fighting words as I've ever read
Listen,
from
the
the bench.
Constitution, like, you can argue all you want about which branch has which power. There is no debate. The branch that has the power to interpret the law is the judiciary.